Today, methane emissions globally around the world are not being measured or quantified in a consistent manner. Nothing existed in Europe on this, and even at member state level, there was little legislation targeted specifically on methane emissions. So we agree and support that such a regulation needs to be developed, but it's technically very complex because it goes into the very details of our operations. Methane emissions cannot be calculated as carbon dioxide emissions can. If you burn a ton of coal or cubic meter of gas, you can calculate with physics what carbon dioxide emissions will be emitted. For methane, it's small leaks in a pipe sometimes, which can theoretically be there. And you wouldn't be able to measure exactly what leaks out of it. So you can quantify it. What you cannot do is quantifying it in the subsea environment. Think about minor, theoretically possible leaks in a subsea environment. It would be a little bubble coming up. And you can not count those bubbles from a submarine down there. You wouldn't get to a good quantification. So technology today does not exist to quantify methane emissions. And it does not matter so much from our perspective because the focus should be on the finding, i.e. detecting possible leaks and then fixing it rather than spending time and money on quantifying exactly. Safety flares is a different issue. For safe operations, some minor flares are needed to be kept flowing all the time. We fully recognize that there should not be venting of natural gas into the atmosphere, with the exception of certain absolutely needed aspects. We also fully recognize that where flaring takes place, i.e. the combustion of gas as part of the operation with these flares you see here and there on a platform or on a production plant, must be highly efficient and should be the exception. However, for safe operations, some minor flares are needed to be kept flowing all the time, so that in case of an emergency, you can ignite immediately and empty your plant with gas, rather than having the gas stream and vent out of the plant. You want to flare it to avoid major emissions. You cannot go around and look for matches to ignite a flame in an emergency event. So you need to have a little flame, just like almost like your gas cooker, going so that you can ignite emergency vents. Nothing existed in Europe on this, and even at member state level, there was little legislation targeted specifically on methane emissions. So we agree and support that such a regulation needs to be developed, but it's technically very complex because it goes into the very details of our operations. The regulation is also, in some areas, just too prescriptive. In our view, it should be more technology open. For example, it requires the use of only 2 types of technologies for detecting possible methane emissions from plants, whereas there is an array of different technologies available to detect emissions, from flagstaffs, looking down on the plant, monitoring the plant all the time, detecting plumes. You can use modern technologies like flying a drone over pipelines or platforms to detect plumes. They are very effective to detect methane emissions almost immediately, rather than having a team of specialists being shipped in or flown into our production sites and going with these 1 or 2 types of devices that are handheld devices along the steel of our facilities, searching for possible methane emissions, which is very cumbersome, a huge effort, a huge cost, and creating a lot of emissions by itself, by this activity, flying with helicopter people and teams in, rather than having just a camera on a flagstaff monitoring the plant all the time, is possibly inefficient with regard to net emissions and also with regard to cost, because again, continuous monitoring systems, which we have installed and can further improve, can better detect emissions immediately. Establishing an import standard is a very complex matter. We have worked on this file now for almost 3 years. So we are at the end of a long process, and everybody really now wants to finish up the work and get to a meaningful, good regulation which is implementable and proportionate. What we should avoid to do now is to rush to COP28 and show a regulation which may be unfinished. We now need to finish baking the cake so that it tastes afterwards. It needs to be an implementable and proportionate regulation, and a few things need to be sorted out before we close this dossier. For example, what do you actually divide by what volume? Is it possible methane emissions by the gas you produce, the gas you sell, by the gas and oil you produce? Is it for the production part only, for the shipping? How do you compare gas which you import from Norway with gas possibly you import from the US or Africa? How do you quantify all this? This needs to be carefully done, especially if you attach legal consequences to it. So let's start with the first step first, establish a common framework of measurement and quantification tools, an important first step, just like learning a joint language before we start having a conversation. If we all talk different languages, we are not getting to where we want to get. You can embed in the regulation already the second step to establish an import or performance standard over time when you have the right tools in place.